On Monday, August 13, 2001, a group of protesters and supporters had gathered at Yasukuni Shrine, where Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi was visiting. Supporters waved Japanese flags and cheered, but there were also angry protesters. His visit was originally scheduled for the 15th, the day Japan surrendered in World War II. But 700 miles away, in front of Independence Gate in South Korea, a group of 20 men were protesting Koizumi's administration. After denouncing his visit to Yasukuni Shrine and calling on him to revise Japanese history textbooks, each protester sliced off a finger. But this isn't really a story about their fingers. This is a story about how a country lost control of its history.
Japanese textbooks whitewashing Japan's wartime aggression.
Japan's sexual enslavement of Korean women.
Or up to 30 soldiers together going about, each one seeming to have the power of life or death.
Before we get into why someone would slice off their finger for some book, I want to tell you a little bit about this channel. Holsian is dedicated to anything I find interesting and worthwhile. If you found this interesting and worthwhile, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. With that out of the way, let's talk about some history. Let's say you're an author writing a textbook for Japanese schools. In the US, it'd be kind of a DIY process. You could self-publish, or you could take your manuscripts to a publishing company. Schools have a plethora of options. But in Japan, you must get your book approved by the government, specifically the Ministry of Education. You submit your book to the Textbook Authorization and Research Council, and your book is reviewed by examiners who may or may not be biased. You may need to make some modifications, but with a bit of luck, you can get your book greenlit. This sounds like the Ministry of Education is like this tyrannical, dystopian organization that controls the worldview of Japanese children. Now, they do have a lot of power over the education system, but Peter Cave, who conducted interviews with several Japanese textbook publishers, said that the approval process is relatively easy. The ministry has even approved books with quote-unquote progressive material. Rather, it was Japan's political climate that really affected what got put into these books. Since 1955, Japan has been dominated by one party, the Liberal Democratic Party. Despite their name, they are actually quite conservative. This conservative government laid the foundation for Japan's textbook system. The modern screening process was started in 1953 by Prime Ministers Shigeru Yoshida and Ichiro Hatayama. Government officials started to criticize the textbooks for being unbalanced and masochistic. They felt like the textbooks were really critical. It was also at this time that the Japanese government was becoming more and more nationalistic. This really changed education in Japan, leading to a mentality of, we're really great because we really did everything right. There were a lot of factors that led to this nationalism. Some of them being that Japan felt like they were being disrespected by other nations. Japan's economy wasn't doing too hot in the 90s. And also, Japanese politicians didn't really like the fact that the US basically came in and replaced their old constitution that they had for like thousands of years with like a brand new one they made in like less than a week. Okay, back to the textbooks. So schools aren't forced to use every new textbook that comes out, but their options are limited. Private schools can choose any of the government approved textbooks, but public schools are at the mercy of their boards of education. This means that public schools have really little choice in what they use. To explain this, let's split Japan up. Now, there are different ways to split up Japan. Today, I'll be splitting it up into national, prefectural, and municipal levels. So at the national level, you have the government, which approves your textbook. At the prefectural level, you have a prefectural board of education. When prefectures decide which schools should use which textbooks, there are special textbook districts. These are in between the prefectural and municipal levels, and they include a few cities or counties. Each textbook district has one textbook for each subject. The books are suggested by a textbook selection committee made of teachers and principals at the prefectural level. For schools that are directly run by prefectures, the selection committee has the final say. But for everyone else, the books are picked by a district selection council for that district. The decisions are funneled down to the boards of the individual towns, but they are supposed to be on board with their district's decision. Okay, so the prefecture recommends the book to the textbook district, the district selection committee chooses that textbook, and then schools themselves use the textbook and everyone is happy, right? Even though the system is technically fine, it has a few points of failure. In 2012, Takatomi, a town in the Yayama district, used a different civics textbook than its district picked. This was a pretty big deal since no one had done this since the system was established. The Ministry of Education, the people who screen textbooks at the government level, even told them to stop and just use their district's textbooks. Just to compare, schools in the US, in 30 states, can independently pick their own textbooks. And obviously, since this system is made of people, it can be influenced. It's designed to give everyone a voice, but there can be some bad actors. Let's talk about the Japanese Society for History Textbook Revision, the authors of the new history textbook. According to an article from Japan Digital Research Center, they claim that the current major history textbooks contain propaganda from Japan's former enemies and treat Japan's young generation as if they were destined to become criminals. I'm sure there's a grain of truth in that somewhere, but let's take a look at what things are in these textbooks. One of the biggest issues was comfort women. During World War II, the Japanese army had these comfort stations. The official story is that these comfort stations had comfort women who were described as private entrepreneurs. But according to first-hand accounts from comfort women themselves, these comfort stations were basically like brothels. Comfort women were treated like, and many of them had been kidnapped from their home and taken to serve at these comfort stations. Many were beaten if they tried to escape. The new history textbook doesn't really talk about comfort women. In fact, mentions of comfort women in Japanese textbooks has gone down in recent years. Comfort women is an issue that the Japanese government has especially tried to shy away from. They did apologize in 1993 with the Kono statement, but since then they've kind of shifted their stance. They've tried to cast doubt on the victims' claims and try to redefine what forcefully meant. But I think the biggest problem is the Nanjing Massacre. During the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, the Japanese army was committing almost every war crime you could. Officers had contests to see who can behead 100 people the fastest. Many of the generals and commanders in charge of the Japanese army at this time became Class A criminals. When the Japanese left Nanjing, they left the city in ruins, with only 0.2% of the population remaining. And it wasn't even just Nanjing. The Japanese army was doing this to all the cities on the way back from the Battle of Shanghai a few weeks earlier. Now, this is all set in stone. There's tons of eyewitness accounts, books, and even movies about the Nanjing Massacre. And the beheading specifically was even covered by a Japanese newspaper. So let's read what the new history textbook has to say about this. The Japanese military believed that Chiang Kai-shek would surrender if Nanjing was captured, and they conquered Nanjing in December. At this time, the Japanese military killed and wounded many Chinese soldiers and civilians, the Nanjing incident. Moreover, various views and data exist regarding the historical facts, including the casualty estimate, and the debate continues to this day. Nobody is debating this. We have pictures, we have eyewitness. This was front page news at the time. It is important to note that while this was really controversial, the new history textbook was barely used. Only one district ever used it, and nobody really liked it. There was also a lot of pressure at the time, both internationally and domestically, to change the materials in these textbooks. Though most textbooks were cutting out controversial material at this time, some textbooks, notably the one published by Teikoku Shoin, increased its coverage. It even included other Asian nations' perspectives. Okay, so knowing everything we know now, what can we take away from this? I mean, for one, it sort of breaks this illusion that Japan is like this perfect, happy place filled with ramen and anime. I mean, when I was researching the video, I was honestly shocked at everything I was reading. As an ignorant foreigner, I didn't really know anything about the history of Japan, except ramen and anime. But I still wasn't expecting a record for the most people killed and like the largest sex trafficking operation in history. And the kicker is that most of this stuff happened less than 100 years ago. I think we can definitely see how important textbooks are to a country. It shapes how a generation looks at their world and the rest of the world. It's also the foundation for children to stand on as adults. And according to James Lauren, author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, textbooks right now are a pretty bad foundation. Lauren writes, "To succeed, schools must help us learn how to ask questions about our society and its history and how to figure out answers for ourselves. At this crucial task, most American history textbooks and courses fail miserably." And there's sort of an obvious parallel you can draw between the US and Japan. The US isn't a saint either, and things do get covered up. Now, I think it's responsible to try and right these wrongs, but I don't think any amount of compensation would really justify what the comfort women went through. Every government does things wrong, but you can't just contradict yourself and deny everything when you get caught. But I guess when you don't have that history, there is no right or wrong.